I mean, we have to wait for our normal stuff, right? I got to start YouTube, wait for YouTube to connect, go to YouTube, listen to the audio, turn off the live chat. I have to go check all of the audio feeds to make sure they're working correctly, but outside of that, ooh, we've got notifications, ladies and gentlemen. Uh-oh, hang on. Let me look. Nothing negative. All right, that's good. All right, I do appreciate that. Going to Theology Central. There we are. Negative. All right, that's good. All right. Test 1, 2, 3. Test. We sound good. All right, turn off the live chat. Someone on YouTube did suggest that some of these messages for the weight of Christmas, that they also be placed under the systematic theology series. The only problem is, at least for the Church One app, some of those platforms only allow you to place the message under one series, unless I would upload it. I could upload them again and change the titles and then put them under systematic theology. And I've struggled with that as well, because we are doing deep systematic theology, but these messages are going to be hidden because they're in a series called The Weight of Christmas, and a lot of people won't bother to listen, thinking they're just going to be your standard Christmas messages, which clearly they're not. So do I change them to something dealing with systematic theology and move them over to the systematic theology series? It probably makes more sense, but then I'm destroying the whole series that I did on the way to Christmas. Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to give that some thought. But I did see that comment on YouTube, and thank you very much for offering it. I just don't have a good solution. All right. Let's see here. The next thing we need to do is I go over here. That's the wrong. Hang on, let's go here. Wait. Let me do this. If I can get this to work. All right, go under webcast, check our audio feed there. There we are. Wrong. Let's go here. Wait. Okay, I think that's ready to go, ladies and gentlemen. I think we are set. Maybe. All right. We have a lot to do. Let's see if we can make this all work. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further delay, we go live in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
Looking at our world from a theological perspective, this is the Theology Central Podcast, making theology central.
Good morning, everyone. It is Sunday, December the 28th, 2025. It is currently 10:58 a.m. Central Time, and I'm coming to you live from the Theology Central studio, located right here in Abilene, Texas. It's Sunday morning. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? I'm still struggling with what to do for Sunday morning broadcast. Do I do 2 hours? Do I broadcast at 10, maybe end around 10:45, start another one at 11? I could probably do that. Do I just do one at 11? Well, obviously that's what I'm doing today. Do I just do one at 10? Do I do one at 10 and then maybe come back at 5 in the afternoon? I don't know. I've still got to figure out how to manage Sunday broadcasting, and we'll figure that out in 2026. We got a whole year in front of us, and we'll figure out what's best and the best way to produce content on Sunday. I think what will happen is no matter when I produce the content or no matter when I go live, most people will probably not listen to it or engage it till Monday or Tuesday. That's probably going to be the way it's going to work. I could probably prove that looking at analytics, that no matter when I broadcast, if it's 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, doesn't matter. In fact, I did a late night broadcast last night about 4 little foxes and 1 big misinterpretation. That was a crazy episode. And I bet you if I look at the numbers, I can probably determine that most of those, any of the downloads or streams have occurred. Well, they probably won't occur till Monday. most likely. So I don't know. We'll figure out Sunday. We'll come up with a plan. But as I'm trying to figure that out, the one thing that clearly I know I have to do today is we've got to try to bring, this Christmas discussion to some kind of close because it's December the 28th. But in a symbolic way, it's kind of good that we're still trying to finish this series on December the 28th. Remember, we called the series The Weight of Christmas because Christmas is heavy. It's not light in any way, shape, or form. It is very heavy, and this series has been very heavy. And I think most people, most churches, they're done with Christmas when they do their little candlelight service on December the 24th, and then they go ahead and participate in celebrating Christmas just like the world does, even though they condemn the world for missing Jesus. Okay, we could get into the whole crazy thing the church does, but the weight of Christmas goes way beyond December the 24th, way beyond December the 25th. In fact, it should last the entire year because what is the weight of Christmas? The weight of Christmas is Jesus himself. It's who Jesus is, because once you start trying to once we talk about the incarnation, things get confusing, difficult, and the church has been struggling with this weight for 2,000 years, all right? So we just have to remind ourselves, Christmas itself is not light, but I think at least the church at large has kind of trained itself, right? It's trained itself to think Christmas is light. Candles, sentimentalism, warmth, vague reassurance. But historically, and that's really the key, historically, the church never treated Christmas as something easy. Christmas forced the church into some of its hardest thinking, some of its most complex theology. And I've tried in a sense to hand you that weight. Now, to be fair, I think one of the things I failed to do is probably to hand you the weight completely. I tried to kind of hand you the weight, but then I would try to take it back and explain it and try to figure it out. I should have just left you with the complexity and go, that's the weight of Christmas. That's the purpose of this series. Now you know Christmas is heavy, and you know why, because trying to figure out who Jesus is complex. Thank you for listening. And next year, but that's not, I have a hard time doing that because I'm sitting there going, I got to figure this out. Because no matter how many years I've studied theology, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many systematic theologies I've read, how many systematic theologies I've studied. It doesn't matter. I still, at times, have just my mind cannot process and try to figure it all out. And I will say the church has never truly figured it out. The modern church has perfected the idea of, this is what our team says. We're just going to repeat what our little theological system says, and everyone thinks it's good and everyone is happy with it. And I think in the most part, a lot of churches, even churches that will actually study Christology, this is just kind of a side note, but it just drove me crazy. So since we've been talking about ancient Christological heresies, the Council of Chalcedon, since we've been talking about all of this, I was just looking at different sermons on the Sermon Audio app dealing with Chalcedon, some of the ancient heresies. And this one just drove me crazy. And I know he probably didn't even realize how it sounded, but he stated something like, now that the holidays are over, we can now return to our study of Christology. Now, on one hand, the church is studying Christology. That deserves an applause. But did you see what the holidays, Christmas time, we can't study Christology during Christmas time because we've got to, decorate the sanctuary and we got to do this sentimental stuff and we got to light some candles and do stuff that the early church would have no clue what you're even doing or why you're doing it and turn it into like a little Hallmark movie to keep everyone happy. Well, wait a minute. What you should be doing at Christmas is studying Christology because that's the weight of Christmas. So it just drove me crazy. And I need you to just understand that the moment we say Well, Jesus was born. The eternal Son of God took upon human flesh. We're no longer just dealing with a baby. We're dealing with God and all of the complexities that comes from that. And then the moment we say, and in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. All right, now we have that baby that's born is God. And then if we move on a little later and we say, Jesus died, wait a minute. If Jesus is God and Jesus died, then God died. What do we do? And for 2,000 years, there's been a lot of trying to figure out how we understand how, being flesh, being God, but still being human, but dying, but not dying because he's God and God can't die. All of that complexity, well, the church struggled with for 2,000 years. And I know I've stated this numerous times in the previous parts, but it is Sunday. So some people may be listening today who haven't been listening all week. I think we tend to create this image that all the ancient Christological heresies, we almost have this image that there was a group of people who met in some, basement somewhere with a pentagram drawn on the floor. And they're like, let's come up with heresies about Jesus. And that's not the way it worked. Every ancient Christological heresy was, in many cases, well-meaning people who had reverence for Jesus, who believed in Jesus, but wanted to somehow try to explain Jesus or protect Jesus or say, well, no, that can't be true. He can't truly be, if he's truly human, then is he truly God? But if he's truly God, can he be truly human? And can God actually suffer and die and still be God? They were trying to figure these things out, and every time they tried to explain it or tried to protect God, they almost inevitably destroyed some element of a true understanding of who Jesus is. But you have to understand their motive was in many cases trying to do the right thing. It's just, I think what it demonstrates is any explanation almost inevitably will lead you into some kind of heresy. All right? So what we've tried to do over the last few episodes is we've tried to walk directly into this problem. I've tried to the best of my ability. And I wanted to resolve it, but we can't. I wanted to maybe try to resolve it emotionally, maybe for me, because the more I talk about it, the more confused it becomes. And I'm like, I got to try to fix this somehow. I didn't want to just smooth it over because that's not the way I do things. I wanted to face it honestly. And when you face it honestly, honestly, by the time you're done, I don't even know if you know what's going on anymore. I've tried my best to show how the church has repeatedly tried to explain Christ. And every single time the church tries to explain Christ, it fell into error. And I don't think it was because they were careless. But I think it's simply because the subject is unbearable. It's heavy. It's the weight of Christmas. It's like, I can't hold this. I can't carry this. So I don't want today to add more struggle. I do not. Man, that's the last thing I want to do. I want to try to offer some kind of clarification. Some of this will be a little bit repetitive from what we have done, but it's supposed to take a step forward and offer clarity, to give us some kind of, there is some light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing, all right? So I want to try to show that at a particular time in church history, I think the church got together to try to say, we've got to carry this weight. We've got to do something, all right? So we're going to go back, just like we did in the last episode in this series. We're going to go back to 451 AD. I mean, that's where you have to go. I mean, 451 AD becomes like, you have to go there. You have to visit 451 AD frequently. If you are a Christian and you've been in church for any length of time, there shouldn't have been a lot of going back to 451 AD. If you've been in church for forever and you've never visited 451 AD, I'm sorry. Once again, it would just demonstrate what I say constantly. The church is the enemy of theological understanding. because it doesn't want to deal with this. In fact, it would be like, wait, go to 451 AD and deal with the Council of Chalcedon during Christmas? How dare you? We can't do that. We've got to have our little Christmas carols and our little Christmas decorations because they don't want to really deal with well, they claim the reason of the season is Jesus, but then Jesus really gets set aside or simply used as a tool to create their little Hallmark moment. And it drives me absolutely crazy. But if you were to stand up in church around Christmas in many churches and say, we're going to go back to 451 AD, we're going to go back to Christological heresies, we're going to go back to Chalcedon, I'm sorry, your church will probably end up closing because you're going to lose half of your people. Even though the people would tell you that's what they want, they don't really want that. They want church. And church is the way it's designed is the enemy of this kind of stuff. So, we're going to go back to Chalcedon, all right? So far, before we get there, we just have to establish a couple of things, all right? We've tried to establish what I'm going to call immovable realities, things that cannot be questioned, all right? Jesus Christ is one person, not two. Now, I know that sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but if you know Nestorianism, you know why I'm saying it, all right? Jesus Christ is one person. Jesus Christ is truly God and truly man. Jesus Christ died. Jesus Christ is one person, not two. Jesus Christ is truly God and truly man, and Jesus Christ died. Now, if you've been paying attention, that was kind of my theological hypothesis that I put forth. And the reason I put that hypothesis forth is because that offers, I think, what are the immovable realities without trying to explain anything. The minute I start trying to explain any of this, I'm going to end up in one of the Christological heresies. And it's inevitable. I mean, we could get into a lot of discussion there, right? And so I'm going to say that this is a fact. I think I can say this. I kind of just alluded to it, but I'm going to state it again. I think any attempt to explain how all of those statements somehow coexist, has historically, I think I know I can say this, has historically produced error. Every single time. Anytime you try, it's going to produce error. Now, because some of these errors are going to collapse the natures, right? Monophysitism, one nature. So that's we don't want that. They're going to divide the person. They're going to so separate the natures that you end up with two persons. Nestorianism, all right? Some are going to try to almost remove God from suffering. Well, then what do you do there? Like that becomes difficult. Or you turn Jesus into kind of a divine. Was he truly God, or did he just appear to be human? You get into all kinds of other weird things when you go there. We could get into Arianism, Docetism. We could get into some of the other heresies. So we then kind of talked about if Jesus is God and Jesus died, well, what does that mean? If Jesus is truly God and Jesus died, what do we do here? What do we do here? So most of the time Christians say, well, he died, but only in his human nature. Well, I mean, God didn't really die. The divinity remained untouched. And I understand trying to say that, but if you're not careful, you almost have like, wait a minute. So the human part died, but the divine part didn't die. So then is Jesus one, or are you so separating it where the divinity watched the humanity suffer? Well, then, so only part of Jesus died? Then it gets very complex and very confusing, all right? And I think what emerges from trying to figure that out is tension, and tension almost inevitably leads to theological danger because our explanations in many cases sound like, I think even when many pastors talk about it, it sounds like only a part of Jesus died. Well, that gets confusing and confounding. So ultimately, where does all of this lead us? It's going to lead you over and over and over to Chalcedon. Every single time, if you want to find some kind of theological something, you end up in Chalcedon. And I don't think Chalcedon provides a solution. It only provides a framework. So we're going to talk about what Chalcedon what happened there. And we're going to talk specifically about the 4 fences of Chalcedon. The 4 fences of Chalcedon. I've alluded to these. I'm going to really clarify it so that you really understand it. So what I want you to do today is I want you to know the 4 fences of Chalcedon. I want you to know them so well that you could explain this to anyone. Chalcedon gives you 4 fences. You have to know these 4 fences, because without these fences, then there's no guardrails and you're almost inevitably going to end up in some kind of theological heresy. All right? So let's talk about this, all right? The Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, we'll get to the fences in just a second, but you need to know this. It did not explain the incarnation. It did not tell us how divinity and humanity somehow coexist. It didn't try to explain it, because I don't know if you can. I think the moment you try to explain it, you end up in heresy. It did not solve the mystery, and it did not reduce the paradox. And I think that's important. If you're going to, in theology, in many cases, you're left with these paradoxes, these tensions, these difficult things, and theological systems are almost inevitably, they arise out of trying to resolve tension, right? Well, we're saved by grace alone, through faith alone, because of Christ alone. Well, if I say that, then people can just sin. Well, no. You're saved by grace alone, through faith alone, because of Christ alone. But if you don't do A, B, C, D, E, well, then you prove you were never saved. So you're never saved. So you have to do A, B, C, D, E. See, it's an attempt to try to, well, if we're saved by grace alone, then, well, what do we? Well, we got to put works in there somehow, and we've got to explain it. Well, the book of James seems to say that we're not saved by grace alone, by faith alone, that we have to have works, and without works is dead. Oh, well, that means if you don't have enough kind of works, then your faith is dead. Oh, then some will come along, try to say you can lose your salvation. All of this is, the Bible gives us these tensions. It talks about salvation apart from works, but then it talks about salvation by works. Then it says we're judged by our works. There's all of this tension and apparent contradiction, and the church has to explain it. And when the church explains it, it develops a system where it all makes sense. And I think in theology should be the study of the tension, embracing the tension, and in many cases acknowledging there may not be a way to truly explain it, versus trying to simply explain it by creating a system that makes it all seem simple and easy. The people in the pew just want to be handed simple answers so that they know what to think. They don't want to have to deal with the difficulty and the confusion. And I say, if you don't want to deal with the difficulty and the confusion, then put away your Bible, put away theology, and just go to church as a community club where you can get a little bit of Jesus, even though that you don't even know what that means, and you can all sing Kumbaya and have a Coke and a smile and a donut or whatever you want to do. But if you really want to embrace it, I'm sorry, you're going to find yourself just losing your mind week after week after week, because there's so many things that, like, wait a minute. Is it this or is it this? Well, no, it can't be that. Well, it could be this. And Chalcedon came along, and what it said is, you know what? We can't explain all of this. We're not even going to be able to resolve all of this. So Chalcedon did something, I think, far more restrained, and I think far more important. It just simply built fences. Chalcedon, in a sense, tells us, here's where you may speak, and here is where you have to stop. See, here you're good here. You can talk. You can try to figure it out. Oh, but whoa. You're getting close to the fence. Once you get to the fence, you got to go back. You can't climb over the fence. That's the guardrail. Chalcedon built the fences. All right? It's not giving you a map. It's simply giving you guardrails. And it gave us four. Four of them. So I would ask you, can you name the four fences of Chalcedon? If anyone can name the four fences of Chalcedon, you get an A+. Go. All right, there's no one here. All right. But if I was at church right now, this is what I would ask everyone to name the four fences of Chalcedon and say, what are they? Now, I don't expect anyone to know. To be honest, I don't expect anyone to know. Because most Christians have probably barely even read the definition of Chalcedon. And if they did, it's only because the church they went to church, hopefully that actually taught theology, made them read it, and they probably never ever looked at it again. I bet you many Christians will have some little devotional nonsense on their refrigerator. I doubt they have the definition of Chalcedon on their refrigerator. Some may have the 10 Commandments framed and put on their wall in their house. Well, we could get into, moralism. Okay, but I doubt they have the definition of Chalcedon anywhere framed in their house. Because it's just not the thing to do. They may have devotional books that are whacked out of its ever-living mind. I doubt they have a book about the definition of Chalcedon. It's so weird because we don't do that, all right? But when we talk about the Council of Chalcedon, we talk about the definition of Chalcedon, all right? And the definition of Chalcedon is what we would call the core Christological statement that arose from the council, all right? So I'm going to read it to you in kind of a standard English rendering. That's what I'm going to try to give you, all right? One and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten. So one and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, to be acknowledged in two natures, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. The distinction of natures being in no way annulled by the union, but rather the characteristics of each nature being preserved and coming together to form one person and one subsistence, not parted or divided into two persons. Whoa. See, this is why this needs to be read like a million times over. Just trying to read that, my brain starts hurting, right? Can you even follow all of that? Now, I've got to be careful here because if I start trying to break this down too much, we could be studying the definition of Chalcedon for the rest of 2026, 2027, 2028, 2029, 2030, to whenever I die. All right, so let's try to read this again. And to the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten. Oh, right there, man. There's a lot to take apart there. To be acknowledged in two natures, okay, truly God and truly man, without confusion. Can't blend them. You can't do that. Without change. That could raise a lot of theological questions. Without division, so you can't divide the two natures too much. There's Nestorianism. Without separation, kind of same concept. The distinction of natures being in no way annulled by the union, but rather the characteristics of each nature being preserved and coming together to form one person and one subsistence, not parted or divided into two persons. Now, I can guarantee you this, that now I'm not saying in every church, even in good churches though, even in good churches that they care about doctrine and theology. If you go to church and you start trying to work on that, I'm sorry, you're going to lose probably a good portion of the people. They don't care. They think it's irrelevant. And that is what just is so confuses me. I've always been confused by the church. The church loves to talk a big game. We care about theology. We care about doctrine. We care about Jesus. But when you really push into this stuff, they'll be like, I don't know. No, I don't go to church for this. It doesn't feel like church. I don't like this. I understand. But if the church is not going to take the time to do this, who's going to do it? And why did the early church, if the early church didn't think it was important, why did they hold an entire council to do this?
And if the people in the pew are the ones who judge the preaching and determines whether it's true or false and can tell a pastor that they're wrong and just leave the church to go wherever they want because they're not happy, and they can condemn the preaching of the church. If the people in the pew are the theological judges, well, then the people in the pew have to know the definition of Chalcedon better than the pastor. Oh, but the people in the pew won't, but they'll still tell the pastor that they're wrong. That's the Protestant system, and it drives me crazy. The people in the pew don't want all of this deep theology, but the people in the pew are the ones who will judge any theological statement that's made. Well, how can you judge it if you're not going to dig into it? If you're not an expert on Chalcedon, then how dare you say anything? If you don't even know what happened in the 7 ecumenical councils, how can you judge anything? The Protestant system they've got to figure that out. The people in the pew can judge the people preaching, but the people in the pew do not have to be experts. That system is beyond broken, all right? But did you notice something in that definition? Did you see the 4 fences? Did you? Now, I'm not going to read it again, but if you notice, now I had to look this up because, when it comes to, certain aspects of grammar and stuff like that, I'm not an expert. But according to how some describe it, there are those 4 adverbs are the definition. They're not illustrative. They're not rhetorical. They're deliberate guardrails inserted after decades of doctrinal chaos. The church had been in doctrinal chaos. Everyone was trying to figure out Jesus. They come along and they add, you can say 4, that the way some sources say 4 adverbs, but there's 4 things that serve as guardrails within that overall definition. All right? Now, scholars throughout history calls them the 4 fences. I did not make that up. They're called the 4 fences by scholars. And they're called fences or guardrails because they are negative definitions. They say what must not be said, in a sense. They kind of say, hey, you can't say this. This is what cannot be said. Now, they do not explain the mechanics of the incarnation. You've got to understand that. They do not explain the mechanics. They simply exist to block specific heresies, not to satisfy curiosity. The definition of Chalcedon is there to prevent and to stop heresy. It's not there to fix all of your curiosity and all of the questions we may have. Chalcedon seems to refuse, they seem to be unwilling to speculate. They definitely did not care to try to harmonize all of the problems. And they definitely did not want to take mystery and reduce it into a very clearly explained mechanism. They did not want to do that at all. And I think that's why it has survived all of these years, is because of what it refused to do. Now, each fence corresponds to a historical error, all right? And well, I'll give you, I'm going to kind of give you the fence, and I'll give you kind of which error it blocks. And we'll get into the fences in greater detail, but I want to try to establish some things here, right? So if you noticed, I probably should have been more specific, but that's okay. I wanted you to kind of think about what are the 4 fences. But I'm going to go back to the definition. All right, here we go. Here are the fences. Without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. The 4 fences of Chalcedon are without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. So how does this work? The first one, without confusion. What does this block? Eutychianism, monophysitism, because they mix the nature. They mix the natures of Christ. They mix them. And monophysitism means one nature. So without confusion, it's like, no. You cannot mix these. You cannot confuse these. without change. Any notion that God mutates or evolves. It wasn't like, well, Jesus was a man, then he became God, or no, there was no change or anything like that. Now, I know that can raise lots of questions on how do we understand the incarnation, but remember, it doesn't try to explain everything. Without division. Well, this is against Nestorianism. You don't have two acting subjects. You don't so divide the natures that you have two separate acting subjects, which almost turns Jesus into two people. Without separation. This is functional separation at birth, death, or resurrection. In other words, you can't separate things in a functional way at birth or at death or at resurrection. Now, that at death is where things are going to get confusing. Well, wait a minute. But God didn't die, but yet Jesus is God. Okay, all right. So I believe Chalcedon is a response, and I could probably even bring in more heresies to see how these things respond to it, but Chalcedon is basically a response to almost every Christological failure that came before 451 AD. All right? So why is this crucial to, well, God dying? Well, how can we state this clearly and accurately? Chalcedon does not forbid saying God died. Chalcedon forbids explaining it badly. Chalcedon does not say, no, you can't say God died. It just says, if you say God died, you can't try to explain it badly because that's almost inevitably what happens. Chalcedon prevents dividing Jesus into parts. You can't do that. Chalcedon protects the divinity. It prevents you from trying to protect the divinity of Christ by abandoning the humanity of Christ. You cannot protect the deity to destroy the humanity, but you can't protect the humanity by destroying the deity. And I think you can't explain the mystery by collapsing the mystery. If you try to explain the mystery of all of this, you have to allow it to remain a mystery to some level. All right? So let's now go back to the four fences and try to bring this to a conclusion. I know I try to go through that as quickly as possible, but I want you to see that each fence was a direct response to these heresies. I mean, there's just no way to get around it, all right? So here we go. And just know, everything I'm saying about the Council of Chalcedon and the definition, I mean, it's verifiable history, all right? This is not me speculating. You can look at the definition for yourself. You can look it up online, all right? So here we go. The four fences. I'm going to state it again. Chalcedon confessed that Christ is one and the same Son, acknowledged in two natures, without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation. And each one of those phrases were deliberate. They weren't just like, hey, I got to hurry up and get home. They were deliberate, all right? Each phrase was to block a specific Christological heresy. And together, they allow us to speak truthfully but carefully about the cross and Jesus dying. So, fence number one, without confusion. This fence says that the divine nature and the human nature are not mixed. God does not become partly human. Humanity does not become partly divine. Divinity does not bleed. Humanity does not become eternal. Now, even right there, if I just try to think, I'll get confused even trying to explain that. See, that's why my hypotheses, I try to even be more precise than maybe Chalcedon. Chalcedon allows for a lot of that, but a lot of that is even confusing. God does not become partly human. Okay, that makes sense. Humanity does not become partly divine. Okay, that makes sense. Divinity does not bleed. See, that's confusing because Jesus is one person, two natures, truly God, truly man, and Jesus died. And so God died. So do you say divinity does not bleed, but Jesus is God and he bled? So see, now the minute I start trying to explain that, well, then what? Well, he only did so in his human nature. You're going to start separating the two natures. Humanity does not become eternal. All right, well, that makes a little bit sense. So the main thing is this fence tries to block this confusion, that the incarnation meant some kind of blending. So when we say Jesus died, the fence tries to prevent us from saying divinity became mortal. Okay, well, I understand we wouldn't say divinity become mortal because divinity can't be mortal. God's essence suffered change. Okay, I understand that we can't have that. The divine nature died. I know we can't say the divine nature died, but then once again, once we say that, then what happens? Well, then the human nature died, but the divine nature didn't. Is that not a complete separation then of the two natures? You see, you fall right back into it. But the fence itself would not say you can't say God died. Because you have to say God died because Jesus is God and he died. So you have to be able to say that. I think it just says you can't confuse the natures. And I think we cannot confuse them. All right? I do agree we can't confuse them. We can't. But how to speak of each of them becomes confusing. See, you can't confuse the natures, but trying to understand them is confusing. I think that's kind of the ironic part of the fence, all right? Fence number 2, without change. This is the idea, this fence is saying that God does not mutate, all right? I think we would agree there. The incarnation is not God evolving. It definitely is not God becoming less God. Now, that's important. And it's not divinity surrendering attributes. God remains immutable, unchangeable, and faithful to himself. But this comes where, well, without change, well, wait a minute. Does the fence then try to block the idea that the cross altered God's being? Well, we don't want to believe that the cross altered God's being. So if we say Jesus died, then this fence seems to be saying, yeah, but God did not cease to be God. I think we would agree with that. Divinity was diminished. We can't say divinity was diminished. And God was changed by suffering. He can't be changed by it. I think we could agree with that. But it obviously does not stop us or prevent us from saying the one who died is God the Son. God the Son did die. But without change. I know that sounds, see, that right there is, you see how my brain's going to start hurting? Fence number 3, without division. All right? Without division, this fence is saying that there are not two acting subjects in Jesus. And this is the one that I struggle with so much, right? Okay, we cannot divide the two natures. So there is not a human Jesus who suffers and a divine Jesus who just sits back and watches. See, that's what I try to avoid. And so much when preachers talk about it and they try to explain it, it's almost inevitably, well, he died in his human nature, but the divine nature, and it's like, well, so the divine nature is just watching? What is going on? And I know that pastors don't mean to do this, but if you start thinking about this, it becomes so hard to know even how to speak of it. There is one Christ. That's a fact. So I think this fence blocks in one sense that only his human part died. I don't know how you can make that work. The person of Jesus Christ died, and that person is made up of two natures, one person, truly God and truly man, and he died. The divine nature remained untouched elsewhere. Does the fence allow you to say that? Jesus died, but God didn't. You can't say that because then you take away Jesus from being God. You see, you can't do that. All actions belong to the person, not the nature. Now, I wonder if we could say that. The person died, but how does the death impact the natures? Does the natures not impact it? But then, okay, well, that gets, how do we understand that? And see, the more you try to qualify it, the more dangerous it becomes, because it starts to divide what Chalcedon refused to divide without division, without division, without division. Now, that may be something to spend more time on, right? I don't have time here because I'm already running out of time. But when we say the person of Jesus died, the person died, but does death not touch the natures? The person of Jesus died, and we don't have to explain the human nature part or the divine nature part. Just the person of Jesus died. And that person, Jesus Christ, is God in the flesh, one person, two natures. Truly God and truly man, and he died. So the person of Jesus died. And do we need to then try to articulate how nature is impacted in that? So, what are the four fences? And I purposely structured this to repeat them more than once. So, without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation. I think Chalcedon allows us to say, Jesus Christ, truly God and truly man, died. That's what I always revert back to. I've got to have something I can cling to. Jesus Christ, truly God and truly man, died. The one who died is and was the eternal Son of God. I don't know if I can say death belongs to his human nature without dividing his person. I don't know how I make that work. Death only happened to the human nature. The divine nature wasn't touched. Well, then that's... How do you not? I don't understand how you do that. I don't know how you do that. I know, and here's what I know about theology. Theology is good at, well, I know what the church will do. It will just say, well, we have to say this because the other doesn't make sense. But sometimes to try to explain something, we just kind of create a bigger problem. And so I think sometimes you have to refuse to try to say anything. I can just state Jesus Christ was and is the eternal Son of God. He took upon human flesh. He was one person with two natures, human and divine, truly God and truly man, and he died. The end. Well, what part died? I'm not even going to try to explain it. I'm not going to try to articulate it. Did God die? God died, but he did not stop being God. How does that make sense? I don't understand. I don't know the mechanics of it. The minute I start trying to articulate the mechanics, it falls apart. Same thing with the Trinity. All you can do with the Trinity is try to place it in some kind of Trinitarian formula and be very careful not to explain it. Many times when Christians try to explain the Trinity with their sermon illustrations, it's inevitably an error. It almost inevitably goes back to Sabellianism, modalism. It goes back to some ancient Trinitarian heresy. One God, three distinct persons, co-equal, co-eternal, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. You got to be very careful. If you go beyond, you're going to end up in some whacked out who knows what. So if I say death only belongs to his human nature, but you're not dividing the person. Does that not sound like I'm dividing the person? I don't know. I don't know what to do there. Chalcedon, I do believe this forbids us from saying that only part of Jesus died. And see, that's why if I say only the human nature died, I feel like I am saying only part of Jesus died. The whole person died. Well, how does that impact the natures? See, I don't know if we can articulate that. We can't say the divine nature necessarily died, because then that would be the death of God and like the divine essence. See, we got to be careful there, but yet Jesus is God and he died. So I don't know. God was absent from the cross. We cannot say that on the cross his deity left him and just the man Jesus died. That is a major problem. Now, I know it's December the 28th and Christmas is basically over, well, for most. But I just want to remind us, Christmas is not a story of a baby. It's the beginning of the story of God coming in human flesh, remaining truly God, truly man, and ultimately committing himself to death. The incarnation is not supposed to be sentimental. In some ways, it's supposed to be catastrophic, right? Once God becomes man, well, then isn't death unavoidable? Because if you become man, human flesh, by definition, he grew, he got older. Death was unavoidable, correct? If God cannot die, well, then Christmas is a lie because the one who came died. And if he's God, you see, and if God does not die, well, then the cross, what was the cross? Just some kind of theater where we kind of get the idea that God is dying, but it's not really God? And if the Son of God does not die, then there is no salvation. And I don't think Chalcedon makes any of this easier. It just tries to say this was the early church trying to figure it out. And I know it's like, well, this doesn't mean anything to me. It's not very practical. I understand. And if people come to church and by the time they would be like, this doesn't feel like church. I don't like this. They want to go to a church that feels like church. I understand. But when are you going to talk about it? When are you going to struggle through this? See, the church spent centuries struggling because Jesus is not manageable. And I think that's the point. See, Christmas, if we're being honest with Christmas, it does not give us a simpler God. Okay, it gives us a heavy confession to try to carry and understand. And if we're going to say Christmas is about Jesus, which the church will always say, then we got to stop reducing him to some safe Hallmark movie. Chalcedon does not solve any of these problems. Maybe it tries to protect us from getting this problem leading us into some kind of error. And I think maybe that's the most faithful thing the church has ever done. Is that in 451, they showed up and like, all right, guys, we got to come up with something. Here are the four fences. One and the same Son, acknowledged in two natures. Fence one, without confusion. Fence two, without change. Fence 3, without division. And fence 4, without separation. And my theological hypothesis that I've put forth is that Jesus Christ is God in the flesh. Or I'll say it this way. Jesus Christ is God in the flesh, one person, two natures, truly God, truly man, and truly died. Now, I'm not denying the resurrection there. I'm not denying that. I'm not saying that divinity ceased. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the person of Christ is God. One person, two natures. Truly God and truly man. And he died. That's a fact. Now, if I start trying to explain, well, what part died? I am going to do something here, all right? I'll end with this. I am going to ask AI a question, all right? Is it possible to say the person of Christ died and that death
doesn't impact nature, or do we need to explain how death impacted either nature and Christ?
All right, I'm going to see what AI says.
All right, here we go.
AI says it's both possible and it's necessary to say the person of Christ died. I do believe that is true. And no, we do not need to explain death as impacting either nature as such. In fact, trying to explain how death impacts the nature is where errors usually begin. Chalcedonian Christology deliberately allows us to say what happened without explaining the mechanics of how it happened within the nature. See, that's what I've been saying. My hypothesis is we can't. I know the church will inevitably say God died, but only in his human nature. They want to start trying to explain the mechanics. And I think the minute you do that, I'm like, you're going back to Nestorianism. Now, of course, you say Nestorianism and the average Christian doesn't know clue what you're talking about. Yet they'll tell you when you're right or wrong about theology. Go figure that. Right? Or you'll just end up with some kind of major problem. AI goes on to say, it writes a small book here. Chalcedonian Christology deliberately allows us to say what happened without explaining the mechanics. Having restraint is not weakness, it is the point. Why the person of Christ is the correct starting point. Death is not something that happens to a nature in abstraction. Persons die. Natures do not die on their own. Nature answers the question what something is. Person answers the question who someone is. Jesus Christ is one person with two natures without division or confusion. So when the New Testament says Christ died, the Lord of glory was crucified, 1 Corinthians 2:8. God purchased the church with his own blood. God purchased the church with his own blood. That's the blood of God, right? Okay. So then divinity does bleed, right? I mean, I don't know how else you get around that, okay? Acts chapter 20, verse 28. The subject of the verb died is always the person, not a nature. That's why the early church insisted on personal predication. What is true of either nature may be said of the one person, all right? So why explaining death in terms of natures gets dangerous when people say things like Jesus died according to his human nature, but not his divine nature. They are usually trying to protect God's immutability, which is understandable. But the language easily slides into, well, only a part of Jesus died. And that is where, and AI now is referring back to, I don't know how many hundreds of hours of conversations we've had. It says, that explains your discomfort. And your discomfort is justified. Because I asked AI, how do most Christians explain it? And as soon as it gave me the typical Christian explanation, I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't handle that. Only his human nature died. Well, what does that even stinking mean? Okay. So it'll slide into only part of Jesus died. Because once we say the human nature died, but the divine nature did not, and we over-clarify that distinction, we risk treating the natures as acting subjects, which they are not. This is functional Nestorianism. That's what I just said. That's what I've been saying. If you study the Christological heresies and then you listen to Christians talk, almost inevitably they sound like one of the Christological heresies. Listen like Christians talk about the Trinity, inevitably they sound like a Trinitarian heretic. Because the church does not give us the theological precision and to discuss these things, yet the people in the pew are the ones judging these things, even though they don't have the theological precision. Now, I blame the church for not giving them the theological precision, but I also blame the people in the pew. Because if you're going to be in the pew and you're going to act like a judge, then who cares if you're judging the church, then it's not the church's job to give you the very information to help you judge it. It's your responsibility to get the information to be able to judge it. And if you're not going to go get the information, then stop judging. Whole thing just drives me crazy. All right? So, once we say the human nature died, the divine nature did not, and over-clarify this distinction, then we risk treating the natures as acting subjects. And this is functional Nestorianism. What Chalcedon actually allows us to say is that Chalcedon does not say the human nature died and that the divine nature remained untouched. I'm going to state that again. Chalcedon does not say, well, the human nature died, but the divine nature remained untouched. It does not say that. Almost inevitably, every church in America will say that. It says one and the same Christ, acknowledged in two natures, without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation. Those four fences do two things at one time. They protect against monophysitism. You cannot blend the natures, and no divine nature absorbs the human nature. And they protect against Nestorianism. No splitting the subject of action. No, well, this part died, and well, that part didn't. Chalcedon refuses to explain how death works across natures. It only assists who died. Who died, class? Jesus. Who is Jesus? God in the flesh. So who died? God. So do we need to explain how death impacted nature? Historically, no. And the church learned not to, because while the church was trying to explain it, it landed up in heresy. We have to say the person of Christ truly died. We have to, because that's Christianity's based upon that. The death was real. It wasn't apparent death. It wasn't an illusion of death. And the death involved the separation of soul and body. The subject to experience death is the eternal Son. What we cannot do or must not do, we cannot treat death as a property of the divine nature, all right? We have to treat the human nature as, these are things we cannot do. We cannot treat death as a property of the divine nature, okay? All right, that makes more sense. We cannot treat the human nature as a separate acting subject. We cannot. And we cannot create some internal mechanic Scripture does not reveal. And this is important. Scripture does not reveal the internal mechanics. It doesn't. It tells us who Jesus is. In the beginning was the Word. He was with God. He was God. He became flesh, and he died. It doesn't explain the mechanics. This is why the church fathers often spoke with almost kind of a paradoxical kind of language. God suffered in the flesh. The impassible suffered. The immortal died. Those are quotes from the church fathers. They weren't being careless, but because mystery requires guarded speech, not explanatory precision. So then AI now goes back to the hypotheses that I gave AI, a couple of weeks ago. It says your instinct is very Chalcedonian. When you said Jesus is truly God and truly man, two natures, one person, he died, the end, that is closer to Chalcedon than any modern explanation. So, because I gave AI my working hypotheses, a long time ago, and then we did everything we can to argue against my hypotheses, but it kept telling me your hypothesis is very Chalcedonian of you. You're sounding like the Council of Chalcedon, and that it's closer to Chalcedon than modern explanations. I think modern explanations deny Chalcedon. And I'm sorry, I'm going to go with Chalcedon before I go over any of these ridiculous modern explanations. Chalcedon was not trying to make Christ easier to understand. It was trying to make Christ harder to distort. And it did so by fixing the subject, the person, guarding the natures, and refusing to speculate. Jesus Christ, one person, truly God, truly man, truly died. I'm going to continue to go back to my hypotheses over and over and over. I should have built the entire episode on my hypotheses, but I did not want to do that. But ultimately, that's where I'm going to come back to. Jesus Christ, one person, truly God and truly man, truly died. Death belongs to the person, not to a nature in some kind of abstract way. Scripture tells us that he died, not how death operates within the mystery of the hypostatic union. When Scripture is silent, the church has to learn to be careful, not clever. Jesus Christ, one person, truly God, truly man, truly died. Death belongs to the person, not to a nature in some kind of abstract way. Scripture tells us that he died, not how death operates within the mystery of the hypostatic union. When the scriptures are silent, the church has to be either silent, extremely careful, but the last thing we can do is try to be clever. And that ends. I don't know if it ends the entire series, The Weight of Christmas, but I think it gets us way further than way farther than I ever thought. I didn't think we would ever get this far, to be honest. I didn't even know where we were going. This took a lot of different detours, but that's the best clarification I can offer you. And it's not perfect, I know, but I think it's the most theologically sound explanation I can give you. Because anytime you try to explain it, you almost inevitably, well, Jesus died, but only his human nature died. And if you don't believe me, go to church and just start walking around asking Christians. All right, so on the cross, God died. See how people respond, but almost inevitably, well, yeah, I mean, God died, but only the human part died. And they're going to start, and when a minute you're like, well, you're functionally a Nestorian. And they'll be like, what is that? Okay, well, Nestorianism, what is that? I'll offer a different explanation. Now you're you're teaching monophysitism. Oh no, what is that? Before it's over, they've gone through every Christological heresy in history. You can say, well, what about the four fences of Chalcedon? They won't know what that is either. And that's just, on one hand, it's a failure of the church. I will agree there. It is a failure of the church. And every Christmas, they have the chance to talk about all of this stuff, but they don't, because they got to plan their next little Christmas pageant, Christmas cantata, whatever they're going to do. They got to do that instead of actually getting into this stuff. With none of those other things are even told to do in the church, then that destroys the regulative normative principle. We can get into all of that. But the issue is it leaves the people in ignorance. But at the same time, I am not going to be nice to the people sitting in the pew. All right? If you sit in the seat of judgment upon what is preached and what is taught as if you are the expert on hermeneutics and theology, then you better be the expert on hermeneutics and theology. And if you don't even know basic church history, how dare you sit there and judge? But that's what the church has built. And that's a whole failure of Protestantism. Maybe it's an unintended failure, but it's still there. So if you're going to sit there and do that, then be an expert. So what should you be doing all the time? Reading systematic theologies, church history textbooks? Now you say, well, I can't do all of it, don't want to do that, don't have the time to do that. Okay, that's perfectly okay. Then show a little bit of humility and show a little bit of caution before you start exercising the authority that Protestantism has given you, that you can be judge, jury, and executioner. Because this stuff is complex. This stuff is, I don't even know if I understand it all. That's why I had to try to reduce it to my hypotheses. So, to end, Jesus Christ, one person, truly God, truly man, truly died. Death belongs to the person, not a nature in some kind of abstract way. Scripture tells us that he died, not how death operates within the mystery of the hypostatic union. Where Scripture is silent, we have to learn to to be silent, even when that leaves us with a lot of, what? Huh? That doesn't make any sense. And I will say, welcome to Bible study and welcome to theology, because you'll be left countless times saying, huh? What? That doesn't make any sense. That's Bible study. That's theology. And really, that should be church. God bless.